So, Mark, I want to get into Ukraine. Seems to be having a bad day, or at the very least, they've had a bad week. There's been the fall of Kharkiv. There's also been the repulsing of or repelling of a counteroffensive that they tried to throw. I want to give a shout out to you because a week before they threw the counteroffensive, you mentioned, well, it looks like they're gearing up for a counteroffensive, and 3 days later, they go through with it.
I think they're still gearing up. I think that was just a diversionary myself.
Oh, diversionary tactic. Oh, so you think they're trying a larger counteroffensive?
I think that's the case, but a lot of it depends on how much forces they're capable of mustering and directing, while Russia, of course, is trying to deteriorate those forces before they can be put into the fray. I think they have intentions of it, right? But they're also having a lot of problems with desertions, a lot of these new forces. I mean, even while some of the new forces, the 155th, were training in France, they were deserting in France already, right? Well before in the battlefield. So, in significant numbers. We're not talking ones and twos, right? We're talking significant numbers. So, I believe they have intentions of launching more offensive, whether in the Kursk area or elsewhere. We'll have to see. I would suspect Bryansk or Zaporozhye they still have significant buildup of forces there. But again, we'll see, because this offensive, offensive is not the right word, right? This was a local counterattack. And I saw, a whole bunch of Ukrainian channels were calling it an offensive, and Russian commentators started picking it up. This is not an offensive, right? This was a local counterattack that was significant as a local counterattack. But for the amount of forces that were involved, to call it an offensive is kind of offensive in military terms. It wasn't that. Like I said, it was a significant counterattack that ultimately failed. First of all, it's clear that the Russians knew exactly where and when it was coming and what it would consist of. And not only that, the Kiev regime's commentators on social media were going ballistic, because evidently the plans were so widespread that a couple days before, Spanish military bloggers were discussing exactly the towns they were going to hit beforehand. Now, that's not to say that, they didn't have some initial, there's zero strategic or military success, right? Or in this, right? They were pumping more forces into Kursk and trying to move up to kind of the northwest of the Suja pocket for a bunch of hamlets that has zero discernible real reason. I mean, not even in the direction of the Kursk nuclear power plant, which would have been more to the west. It was more to the northeast. Sorry. I don't understand, other than information war purposes, which obviously failed disastrously as well, why they would have done this. Maybe they had some reason to believe that Russian forces would be particularly weak in that direction. Maybe that's simply, but if that was so, then that was drastically wrong. They just targeted a number of hamlets, and they surged forward and took about half of a number of hamlets for a day or two, and they've already been soundly defeated and pushed out of those. Now, they had a number of they had a number of tanks, a number of armored vehicles, but there's a couple of interesting things. One is, evidently there are reports that they were utilizing a new electronic warfare system that had like a sphere-shaped diameter of area of effect in the lead, right? In over the demining vehicle, the demining tank, and the tanks that were following it in the initial vanguard of at least one of the convoys. And evidently Russian, presumably provided by the West, right? Now, the reports, again, unconfirmed, are that traditional Russian FPV drones were useless. They were losing contact with them. As soon as they entered, it was a small area of effect, but definitive. Yeah. However, this is the thing, is that Russian forces have already, to a very significant degree over the last half a year, shifted to fiber optic cable controlled drones, which seems, when I first heard of it, it seemed absolutely improbable, right? These are like micro fine fiber optic, incredibly long. And you would think they would, I don't know, get stuck on something.
Yeah. You think
really don't understand how they work, but they do. And so the effectiveness of this electronic warfare jamming was diluted because Russians have already started using, to such a great extent, the fiber optic drones that are completely invulnerable to electronic warfare jamming. So they quickly shifted to all of that. Also, Russians pulled up some Ka-52 alligators that we haven't seen really since the Zaporozhye offensive days. They obviously had those in place to help deal with it. And it kind of became a turkey shoot, right? Now, some of the armored vehicles were obviously able to unload some of the troops they were carrying, but all of the tanks, all of the demining vehicles, most of the armored vehicles, everything quickly was destroyed. It has not been a successful, counterattack for the amount of forces that were lost in it. And another interesting thing, again, reports on the ground, is that it seems that a very large number of these troops that were involved in this counterattack were prisoners, that they were prisoners. And this was, they identified them, not only once they captured some and interviewed them, but a very large number of prison tattoos on bodies and the like. So it seems that a very significant number of these troops may have been considered, shall we say, disposable. I mean, beyond, above and beyond what the Kiev regime normally considers its troops to be. So a scattering of some, of their remaining top, elite ideological troops, but then large numbers of prisoners as well. Yeah. Well, I mean, whether it's, my understanding is that prisoners are now forced, but it's also part of you serve, you get out of your prison sentence, much like Russia has done, and still does. It started to do with the ill-fated Wagner, but then was carried on by the Ministry of Defense to a lesser degree for their own assault units. So this has largely failed. And it has to be kept in mind that even while this counterattack was going forward and Russia was dealing with it, they were still continuing with their own offensive, actually to the south of Suja. That continues to have success. They continue to take, a hamlet, a day. This is not a well-populated area. The biggest settlement, right, that the Kiev regime managed to take on their Kursk incursion, Suja, which is, where everything is now centered around, this pocket around Suja, that was only 4,000 to 5,000 people before the conflict. So these are not, and when you don't have that many buildings, it's really hard to make a critical mass of troops because you don't have anywhere to billet them, to protect them. Right?
Yeah, where do you hide?
Yeah, where do you hide? I mean, it's winter. You need, shelter for any considerable amount of time. Yeah. So, but they keep pouring. From what I've heard, reinforcements are really not going to any other area of the front. They're not going to Pokrovsk. They're not going to the Turretsk area. They're not going to the Kupiansk Liman area. They're going just to Kursk, which makes zero sense. Again, except for they seem to. I mean, Zelensky has invested an incredible amount of political capital. He continues to insist that this Kursk incursion is crucial and that the Kiev regime can't lose it, because once the negotiations start in January, they'll trade it back for Russian terror, and they'll impress Trump by the fact that they're still able to hold I think this is all just absolutely delusional. First of all, there's not going to be any real negotiations that start in January once Trump. I mean, they might start talking, but it's not like things are going to be wrapped up with a ceasefire in a few months. That's not going to happen. Russians have made that clear. So I don't know what's going on in Zelensky's head. I imagine it's pretty twisted.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, I can't think of any other reason short of, I'm going to hold on to this land and we're going to exchange it for Ukrainian territory.
And simply that if they withdrew from it, if they gave up on it, or if they're driven out of it, which they are, just a bit at a time, they've got less than, I would say, around 40% of their original incursion zone less, probably less than 40%. That it will cause probably significant political damage to Zelensky, because this has largely been portrayed as his initiative, right? This is his, the Kursk was his offensive. And there are other forces within the Maidan milieu, Poroshenko, Klitschko, even Budanov is, hanging on an edge because Budanov is the Kiev regime's sociopathic military intelligence chief. Kirill, I like the Budanov.
Yeah.
Zelensky's powerful gray cardinal chief of staff, Yermak, has been wanting to get rid of Budanov for about a year now. So I imagine that Budanov is politically plotting now with people outside of the Zelensky circle as well, which is not to say that if any of this happened, right, whether Zaluzhny was brought back, whatever happened, that anything would change for the better, right, in the Kiev regime. It would still be the Kiev regime, but I think it might do substantial political damage that might open up avenues for other people within the Maidan regime.
Basically a removal of Zelensky because of how bad this turned out.
It's possible, right? And he has to at least fear the political damage. Whether it would actually result in any change of power, that I still think largely depends on U.S. blessing. But there's also an open question of, once Trump takes office, where does Trump's blessing go in Kiev? I would imagine that if it goes to anyone, it probably won't be Zelensky, right? So I would imagine that some other people will try to present themselves that I can do better for America than Zelensky, right? Because everyone knows that Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. He only cares about, America, ostensibly, or Trump, right? So they may try to present the whole situation as Zelensky is the problem, and I can recover it. But regardless, this it has not been a success. I still expect more, right? There's too many strikers, too many Abrams tanks provided by Australia, too much ammunition and missiles that the U.S. provided that have not been seen on the battlefield yet, right? And we do have buildup of troops again in the Zaporozhye region and in the Sumy region in the direction of Bryansk. Whether, again, that's enough for a critical mass for another offensive or a real offensive, that's an open question. But I tend to believe that this isn't it. That there's still some more suicidal kick left in them, that they're not done yet.
This is so sad.
You're right that it has been very bad, though, because on top of Karahava being liberated now, which is really important because, one, it was one of these three logistics and supply centers behind the Kiev regime's defensive lines. First, Sleboda fell, then now Karahava has fallen, and Pokrovsk is rapidly being encircled, and the battle for Pokrovsk is about to start itself. But also, Karahava was the last real location from which artillery shells could be directed at Donetsk city, which means that for the first time since 2014, Donetsk city had a New Year's, a holiday season without fear of artillery or pedal mines being dropped on them or anything of this sort. This is significant for the people of Donbas. It's for the first. It took that long to push them all out of that artillery range. Now, if they want to waste a HIMARS, theoretically they can still do that, right?
The normal munitions, not so much.
But normal artillery are now completely out of range of the.
Let me ask you this: what about Arestovich? I mean, if Donald Trump is looking for somebody to, I don't know, replace Zelensky that seems to be more willing to end the conflict, Arestovich has been pretty loud about this.
He's been pretty loud, but I don't think he has a power base in Kiev to activate. And he would need that. Yeah, he's become too much of a bête noire figure within the he's already seen as an outsider. I don't think that's possible. I mean, maybe after the regime is completely overthrown, he could have dreams of coming back, but the Russians remember him too closely to allow that. I think his days are over.
I want to get your take on something else.
One more thing that you mentioned, Karahova, but Toretsk has also fallen, right? Toretsk is now in Russian hands by all reports on the ground. The Russian Ministry of Defense has not announced it yet, and there's still demining, desabotage work, right, to do. And there might be still a few isolated Kiev regime holdouts and basements, and something like that. But the battle for Toretsk, for all intents and purposes, is over. And some of the Russian advanced forces are already moving on to the next target, which is a water reservoir, reaching the banks of a water reservoir to the north, direct north of Toretsk. So Toretsk has also effectively fallen into Russian hands. I would expect the Russian Ministry of Defense will probably officially announce it sometime within the next week, right? They're always very cautious with these things. But Russian reports on the ground, and the only reply the Kiev regime can make is that they're conducting FPV drone attacks on Russian forces who are consolidating the last bits of the city, which is to say, they're not there.
Right.
We're flying stuff in, but military bloggers, who are doing the mapping, when you're doing FPV drones attacks on troops in a territory, that's actually in the favor of the troops owning that territory, right? It was in the very north corner of Toretsk. So as far as everyone can tell at this point, the months-long battle for the Toretsk, New York agglomeration is over.
Wow, that is.
And Chasiv Yar is also on its final days as well, I would venture.
They seem to be getting weaker faster, or is it? Or am I missing something?
No. They are. I mean, it's still not what most people think of as Hollywood breakthroughs, right? The U.S. pushing through non-fighting Iraqi forces in 2000. That's because that's the conception that's burned in people's minds. This isn't this type of war, but for the scope of this conflict, yes. I mean, this is a bleeding operational crisis for the Kiev regime in the southwest Donbas. Russia is going to roll up the rest of the Donbas within 2025, right? By the end of 2025, I expect that all of Donbas will be fully liberated. They seem completely unable to stop, right? They can slow Russian forces down in a few select areas, like they did in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, but even then, it's just a grinding progress for the most part. And once Pokrovsk falls, I mean, you're going to see the Western mainstream media go into another fit of depression and recriminations and finger pointing, because that's really only going to leave one significant defensive line left. That's the Konstantinovka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk defensive line, and that's really important, not just because of it's the final defensive line
Yeah.
effectively in the Donbas. But also that's the Slavyansk and Kramatorsk is where the initial uprising in 2014 against the Maidan Putsch started. Right, that's where the Donbas, the Russian Spring, as they called it in the Donbas. We don't accept this, the overthrow of the government we elected in Kiev. That's where it started in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So that it kind of all ends in the Donbas where it began, which is kind of, I guess, poetic, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the word poetry and war has any relation, it definitely, in the human experience it does anyway.
Actually,
I don't know whether that's a good thing or bad thing about humanity, but I think you're right that there is a connection between war and poetry in human history. Whether it's warranted or not morally is another question.
Oh yeah, the morality they don't play a part of it. It's just there's a connection between the two.
Yeah. Very bad.
Well, I want to go to Zelensky for a bit, but before I get to Zelensky, because he was talking about embezzled money, which I'm fascinated by, that he even admitted it. But there was a conversation, I think it was Alexander McCarris, and he was making this point that Russia doesn't want all of Ukraine, which I agree with, and that at a certain point, there has to be this kind of middle spot where Russia is like, okay, we don't necessarily want to go further, and we don't want to take the pain of going further. By the same token, the West doesn't want Russia to go any further and is willing to make a deal at that point. Meaning there's like a spot on the map where both sides say, okay, we're done. Yeah. I mean, you see it that way. I don't think Russia wants all of Ukraine. So yeah, I agree with you.
I absolutely agree with the person that you mentioned in that, certainly that wasn't what the Kremlin wanted when they started this conflict. And it's probably what they still, don't want now, but increasingly I think that there's an understanding that they may have to, that the West is giving them no option, that they're not going to make a deal and divide Ukraine, right? This is not 1945. This is not the Treaty of Westphalia, right? You're not going to see some signed document where, there's some kind of Korean style armistice line drawn. No, I don't think that the West will ever do that. I think that Russia will be forced to continue, and at some point it will be, if we stop, right, all they're going to do is pump as many weapons and arms into whatever is left, and then you're left with, this war first started, I was entirely against the Russian occupation of West Ukraine, because they really do hate Russians there, right? By and large, right? I mean,
which is why I don't think they wanted to take all of it.
They don't want to, but they may have no choice, because anything that they don't take now is just going to be weaponized against them. The entire population there will be just raised as a Western warrior caste to restart the conflict, in a few years as soon as possible by the West, right? They'll be trained. And I think at this point, the terrible costs of a occupation and the resulting guerrilla war in West Ukraine are actually less than the costs of a rump West Ukrainian Banderite statelet that will continue to be weaponized actively against Russia. So, and I think that may be part of the plan. I think part of the U.S. plan, at some level, not their initial plan, but say maybe Plan D or Plan E is, so the Russians, are just going to keep going. We're not going to give them what they want with some kind of deal that officiates this or admits that we lost here. We'll make them fight for every inch, and let's see them choke on it. That I've actually heard that discussed in some articles in the West, and I think that
I've mentioned it to you. I think I said the same thing to you, that it seems that the objective is let them take it all, and then we have this kind of guerrilla war, like an Operation Gladio in Ukraine. Proper.
Yep. Yeah, I think that may be a fallback plan that is rapidly being pushed up the chain of possibilities at this point. Because again, Lvov, Ivano-Frankovsk, Ternopil, these places, this is, it's not Russian friendly territory, right?
Mhm.
It's completely different in the Donbas or, the Kherson and Zaporozhye, where, the majority of the population is either Russian or Russian sympathetic, or at least apathetic to who rules, right? For some of the population that doesn't have a strong national identity conception one way or another. But that becomes less and less the case as you move further west into that Western Ukraine that wasn't even part of Ukraine. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and part of Poland for centuries, briefly part of Poland for centuries, up until the eve of World War II. There's only lesser of bad situations with regards to an end game in Ukraine. There are no good solutions.
Way out. Yeah, that's what I remember when you first came on. I used to ask you, how does this end? Because I don't see how they extricate themselves from it.
It doesn't ever end. It will always, whether it's a frozen conflict, a guerrilla war, or something, there will not be peace in Ukraine for probably the rest of my life and probably the rest of your life too.
Zelensky said something, admitted something that I'm fascinated by. So he said a lot of crazy stuff in this interview, but this very specific part where he's talking about money. Yes, because he's talking about like $170 billion were allocated, and he said we only got half of it. So where's the rest of the money? And he was like, I didn't want to say anything about it because you guys could just stop sending me money, but I could say it now. I want to get your take on this.
During all this time of the war, around 177 billion have been voted for or decided upon. 177 billion. Let's be honest. We have not received half of this money. The second point, which is very important, just as an example, is it corruption? The first question, whose corruption? This is the second.
Okay.
He is pointing out that go for it. Well, I was just going to say, he's pointing out that all of this money, we only got half of it. The U.S. is putting a lot of that money back into weapons. You guys are forcing me to take this shipments from point A to point B. And he's saying, look, this is corruption. I mean, yeah, Ukraine may have corruption, but this is also corruption in the way that you guys are grifting money off me. Give me your take on this. I mean, because that's a big deal.
This is called deflection and projection, right? And so he's answering a direct question about Kiev regime corruption, right? And he's trying to say, you do corruption too, right? It's deflection. Yes. I mean, there's a whole lot of overhead costs built into the U.S. military-industrial complex that any sane person could identify as corruption. But the U.S. Congress knew when they voted for that $177 billion that they were not going to be handing $177 billion or $170 billion worth of arms directly to Zelensky. That's the way the U.S. military-industrial complex and pork in the U.S. political systems works. Is it corruption? Well, no, it's not corruption when America does it, certainly, right? Okay, so Zelensky may have a little bit of a point there, but he's really just trying to deflecting from Friedman's question on his own. And when 50%, of the arms that of some types anyway that are actually delivered to the Kiev regime, actually delivered to Ukraine, then are disappear onto the global black market. He's trying to deflect away from that.
I thought that number was 70%, if I'm not mistaken. At least what I thought.
At one point it was. I'm trying to be a little.
Be nice.
At one point we heard a 70% number. I'm trying to be. I don't do optimism, but I'm trying to be safe, on the conservative level here. So, I mean, that's again, that's something that Ukraine needs to consider and factor into the way they do, because Ukraine has been ridiculously corrupt since '91. They never had a Putin that, I mean, which is not to say that there isn't corruption in Russia. We've seen a number of Defense Department officials that have ended up in bars during this conflict. But I think one of the most admirable things is that Putin took advantage of this conflict to really root out corruption out of the defense ministry, at least corruption of a significant scale, and to go after figures that had some kind of seniority and some degree of roof or political protection before. So that is not the case in Ukraine, and it's absurd to even try to compare the level of corruption. This Lex Friedman interview, I mean, Lex Friedman is a thing. I've watched a few of his interviews of other people in the past, and he does not ask critical, probing questions, right? No. That's not his style, and certainly none were asked. Zelensky was called on none of his BS, right? None of his propaganda was he called. That's but you don't expect that from Lex Friedman. No. He tries to provide a sympathetic ear to encourage the other people to speak, freely. That's what he does. But I think it's really interesting. So Friedman comes, he's, his family are immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and he speaks fluent Russian. He speaks fluent Russian. So when Zelensky's office officially agreed to this interview, finally, because Friedman's been working to get it for years, he said he actually wrote on social media, Friedman did, that, look it, right? I understand that it's a political thing, but you speak fluent Russian. In fact, you don't speak very good Ukrainian, to be perfectly honest. He didn't say that, right? And I speak fluent Russian. And if we were to do this interview in fluent Russian, right, even with the understanding, it would be a much better interview. We wouldn't have to deal with interpreters. It would be more dynamic. We would understand each other completely. And of course, Zelensky, who speaks, better than me, but he speaks very poor Ukrainian, right?
Because he was
he is a native Russian speaker. His family are native Russian speakers. All of his films, all of his comedy, right, that all occurred in Russian, right? All of his financial success as a comedian, all of his movies, that was all in Russian, that are no longer watchable in Ukraine without dubbing in Ukrainian, by the way, which is hilarious. His own movie, the president's own movies, right? But he struggles often for words in Ukrainian. And even during this, he said no, right? That's the language of the killers. And he said specifically, I have nothing but contempt for the Russian people. Not the Russian Putin, not the Russian government, for the Russian people, the Russian language, the Russian culture, all right, which has all been clear for a long period of time. So he said, no, this has to be conducted in Ukrainian, right? And they did it officially that way. But if you listen to the interview, you don't hear it when you're not a speaker, but he frequently slips into Russian because he doesn't know which Ukrainians to reach for. And he frequently slips into mat, which is foul, bad language, Russian bad language, right? And Russia, right? Like in English, you got like 7 words to curse in, right? 7 words, right? And that's being generous. In Russian, there are entire dictionaries of mat, of bad language. That is much more foul and socially taboo than the 7 words that aren't allowed to appear in some Hollywood movies, right? It's much more socially frowned upon, which not to say that it doesn't happen, but my wife does not want me learning any mat. I'll say that. I'll say that out, frankly. So, but swearing is an art form in Russian. Not it's a skill and an art form, and there are entire dictionaries. No word of lie, no word of exaggeration. There are dictionaries of cursing, of mat in Russian. So he frequently slipped into that, right? And sometimes in English, right? So he the interview was actually conducted unofficially in 3 languages, right? Ukrainian officially, right, through a translator, English that Friedman spoke, and that Zelensky tried, he tries to speak English at times, and all the times that they fell into Russian, even though it was not to be held in Russian again, and that's simply because of Zelensky's poor Ukrainian, which it's so funny in this part of the world. It's sad.
Yeah.
It's sad, but it puts kind of a human face on the whole idea of this Banderite regime that Zelensky didn't start out as, but has internalized, just as Poroshenko once did,
Right.
and has become this. Again, when 25% of the Ukrainian population was ethnic Russian before this conflict began, and you're taking away their language, their political parties, their media, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because it's not 100% politically loyal to the Kiev regime, all of that. In the West, they try to present the Kiev regime as it's democracy and freedom. It's not.
Right.
It's not any stretch of the imagination. It is a tyrannical, little dictatorial West Ukrainian Banderite regime that is focused on purging, making Ukraine a mono-ethnic, unitary ethnic state on their conception of what it means to be Ukrainian, which is not shared, needless to say, by even, more than half of Ukrainians, I would say, but at least half of Ukrainians, right? Who have when they're not ethnic Russian, even when they're Ukrainian, so let's say East Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, they have a completely different national identity conception of what it means to be Ukrainian. And it just doesn't coincide with Banderite fascism. It says that, they're Russians. Yeah, my cousin is Russian. The guy next door is Russian. They're just a brother people. There's a border there now.
So 2000, so all of this started in 2008 then, at the point where the U.S. offered NATO membership, meaning, is that where the friction, ultimately really kicked off?
I think that there has politically within Ukraine, there has always been a degree of friction since 91 between West Ukraine and East Ukraine, right? If you take a look at any voting map in Ukraine, you can see clear geographical differences in every election all the way up through, right? Those political differences are, an extension of social differences, right? That are much more significant than, let's say, voting patterns between the North and the South in the United States. It's much more significant than that. And again, it's not a simple matter of ethnicity. It's not simple matter of whether you speak primarily Russian or Ukrainian. It's kind of a combination to a degree of all of these things. And it's competing conceptions of Ukrainian national identity conception. I don't want to say it's, Russians v. Ukrainians, because it's not really about that. It's not Russian language versus Ukrainian language speaking. It's not followers of this church against that church, or several make-believe churches, or whatever they've come up with. It's more complicated and organic than that, and it's all about Ukrainian history and culture and politics. But yeah, there are some Ukrainians that lean towards Russia, and there are some Ukrainians that lead towards Banderite fascism. And I'll just leave it that way, because I can't even say that they lean Western, because the modern West is not their ideal either, right? Certainly not modern Europe, right? They're anti-LGBT to an even higher degree. Their connection is with the fascist ideologies of the 1930s and 40s in this case, a particular West Ukrainian, evolved one that existed alongside and for the most part cooperated with Nazism in Germany. That's why I don't like to use the term neo-Nazis, right? They're Banderites. It's a homegrown. There were homegrown fascists in Croatia, the Ustasi, right, in Slovakia, Romania, even some in Bulgaria. They all had their homegrown fascist ideologies. Well, in Ukraine, it was the Banderites, the Banderovci, and that Banderism is still the undergirding of everything that has happened in Ukraine since 2014 and continues to be.
Wow.
It's the vanguard and the structure underneath. In fact, in 2000, it was either 2017, 2019, I forget the exact date. There was even a Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty article that identified Azov as a neo-Nazi state within a state in Ukraine. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, people, right? In a slightly more honest age, less than a decade ago. So all of this whitewashing and apologism they've tried.
There are no Nazis in Ukraine, as they keep saying. There are no Nazis in Ukraine. Before I let you go, one last thing. So Donald Trump has come out and is effective. Well, I guess there are two things. One, Nord Stream. So there is a conversation taking place in the U.S. about buying Nord Stream. Now, I don't know how they would do this, considering
there are also conversations about buying Greenland and taking the Panama.
Well, and that's what I was going to get to. So Trump is now threatening military force to take Greenland and the Panama Canal, and even threatening economic force, as he called it, to take Canada. And the most interesting thing to this is that, Europe made their own bed on this one. If you think about the overthrow of Ukraine, okay, that's a sovereign state being destroyed because they didn't like the politics. They called it a revolution. If you think of what's taking place in Romania, where the courts just killed it because, again, they didn't like the fact of this guy's political framing. If you look at Georgia, where they're trying to overthrow the Georgian government, like in one case after the next, Europe didn't necessarily care about this kind of representative or democratic governments that they didn't like. And now Trump comes in and says, hey, that's a nice Greenland you got there. And it's like, okay, well, what is Europe going to do about it if Donald Trump decides to take it?
Okay, I don't think it's quite gonna work where the U.S. orders military troops to take Greenland, and it's sometimes it's interesting to me on a kind of voyeuristic, train car wreck level to see what ideas get stuck in Donald Trump's mind and how he runs with them. And
it is weird. It's out the blue. Yeah.
And how much of it is real? How much of it is him playing to a persona? I honestly don't know and don't really care. I'm pretty sure that at the end of Trump's 4 years, Greenland will. Whether it's a part of Denmark or not is an open question, but whether it's part of the United States, I very much doubt. I also similarly doubt that the U.S. is going, or any U.S. company is going to buy up Nord Stream. And again, they don't. The idea there is to use the existing pipeline network on German territory, not the undersea pipelines, for the purposes of providing easier distribution of U.S. LNG. That is not going to happen. It's not a well thought through. It's somebody's crazy harebrained idea that has been promoted on the front pages because Americans just seem to think that's a really cool idea for them to take control of the last pipeline that they didn't blow up. But I seriously doubt that is going to happen.
I don't even know how that would work. I mean, it's Russian gas. I mean, how are they going to get U.S. gas through German pipe? Yeah, I don't get that one. I never understood that one. That's why I was asking. I didn't see how that was going to work. It's
again, they don't want the pipeline underneath the Baltic. That's not what they're concerned about. They're concerned about the onshore piping distribution. Again, and here's the thing. The company that built and owns Nord Stream is not just Russian, right? It is a and it's not just Russian German. It's actually a consortium of European energy majors. The French were involved in that. The British, the Italians, the Germans. Right there, this was a consortium where they all had shares invested in this big pipeline. And the idea is that they would use part of the existing network that is on German land territory to make easier the distribution of U.S. provided LNG once it's transferred back into a gaseous form. But it's not really that useful or possible or capable. It's a very harebrained idea as far as I can tell. I mean, I'm not an oil or gas export in this case, but from what I've read, it's not serious.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I don't know how Trump comes up with this stuff. It wasn't something he brought up during the election. It just came out of nowhere, and he just stuck on it at that point.
This is the thing about Trump, is sometimes it seems to me anyway, that the most important thing is who talked to him 15 minutes ago and managed to stuck an idea in his head. Let's be generous and say he is mercurial and quixotic that way.
2 minutes. One more thing. 2 minutes. Is there any pathway you see to this ending short of Russia taking the whole territory? Meaning, if Trump could sit down, or somebody sits down and they have a conversation, and Russia says, "I want this, and this will be okay. We will be perfectly okay with this to end it without us taking all of it." What would that be? Or does that even exist?
There will be no deal, no signed papers between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine. It's not
just going to be on the battlefield. Yeah,
it's going to be on. Now, there are other possibilities that I see no avenue for right now. If there is some type of internal political regime change in Kiev and someone who wants to end the war comes to power and then is somehow officiated in such a way as to legitimately represent the state of Ukraine, which, remember, Russia right now doesn't even recognize Zelensky as capable of signing any papers legally, right? He can sign them, but he's not legally the president as far as they're concerned. And he could sign it and it would mean nothing to the next, the future of, a Ukrainian state's, politicians, right? So they would feel no compulsion. So, how can that end? And
yeah,
these are all what if scenarios, right? That have no clear avenue of how they would happen right now, because the real political opposition in Ukraine was banned and has been lustrated and pogromed and driven out of the country. The leader of the largest real opposition party in Ukraine, right? The opposition bloc, he was captured and traded to Russia in a prisoner of war exchange, a Ukrainian citizen, Viktor Medvedchuk, right?
I remember that. Yeah, I remember
him. Yes, he certainly doesn't agree with the Maidan or everything that happened since, but he represented politically, right? Eastern Ukraine to a very significant degree, right? We can talk about, yes, lesser of two evils. That's democracy everywhere. He certainly wasn't a perfect candidate for anyone, but he represented the views of essentially half of Ukraine. And he was, those views, right, are no longer politically acceptable in Ukraine, right? There can be no revisiting of the Maidan geopolitical flipping of Ukraine that occurred in 2014. So all political parties, media, anyone who might suggest having a non-anti-Russian foreign policy is forbidden, right? It cannot be allowed to happen, right? It doesn't even have to be a pro-Russian, but simply a non-rabidly anti-Russian foreign policy. That can't be allowed.
Neutral doesn't exist. Yeah, it is. Wow.
This is why I believe one of the many reasons that this regime is just going to have to be rooted out, root and branch, from Kiev and probably further west as well, that there can't be any coexistence, and that there between it and Russia, and that there will be no peace of any sort in Ukraine until it's removed from this cancer is driven completely from the Ukrainian body politic.
How would that work, though? Would that mean they would have to put in a puppet government?
Oh, sure.
Puppet
puppet government. They would do in reverse everything that the Maidan has done since 2014, right? All the Maidan parties would be banned. All of the officials who ever served in the Maidan government would be lustrated. They could never serve office again. All of the media outlets, that put out pro-Maidan would be banned. Western NGOs that fund them. Basically, everything that the Maidan regime did since 2014 will have to be done in reverse, right? Which, as far as I'm concerned, it's quid pro quo now, right? You did it, and you portrayed it as freedom and democracy when you did it, right? Because it was pro-Russian, right? Like half of Ukraine. But of course, it will be called tyranny and Russian military occupation when it happens the other way around. But do we really care about the perception in the Western media anymore? No, we don't.
No,
we don't. We don't. Yeah. And again, having extensive, my wife is Crimean. We have family in Donbas and Kharkov and Odessa, all over East Ukraine. The people of East Ukraine don't give two figs what Americans think about how, what is going to happen in post-Maidan Ukraine either.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't even consider ethnic Russian Ukrainians. I mean, at a certain point, we didn't even, that wasn't even part of our media space. Mark, man, thank you for this, Mark. I always appreciate the explanation of what takes place. And again, as I point to my audience, you tend to be more right on this stuff over the past several years than anybody else. So
and I hope every day that I'm wrong.
Yeah, but you don't tend to be. So there's that part. Mark Sleboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. You can also, there we are. You can also find him on his YouTube channel at Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, and on Facebook.com/Gramsci, the voice of reason and reality, Mark Sleboda. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it, Mark.
Thanks for having me.